stuff, so sometimes I end up, going on a little bit more of a tangent, but, alright, so good. Alright, so, when we go into a lake, and we try and assess, and this is from the lake manager, lake ecologist viewpoint, what are we looking at? And this is important for you guys to understand, because this kind of, if you guys understand our thought process, then you understand kind of how we get to what our thought process gets to what your thought process is as far as lake homeowners, and then how do we deal with these issues. So we go into a lake, we try to identify the issue. All right, what's the problem? Is it plants? Is it algae? Is it sediment? Sediment's another big issue in lakes. Turbidity, and sediment obviously has a whole bunch of different issues that affect lakes. If you have too much sediment, you could actually be smothering fish beds. So especially sunfish, we see sunfish spawn out. They have these little depressions and about a foot of water next to your docks. Anytime you have an increase in sediment, that stuff will choke out the fish eggs. Sediment also, sediment also has a lot of phosphorus in it and other contaminants it can hold on to. So anytime it's pushed into the lake, it's potential carrying those nutrients or those contaminants in. And also, when you have sediment that's kicked up and it's not bound, by plants or some other structure, it's going to be kicked up constantly, and your water's going to be dirtier, and nobody really wants to, swim in really, really dirty water. So what's causing the issue? So we have a problem. So what's causing the problem? So we look at the nutrients, maybe light and temperature, depending on if we're talking about algae. If it's a plant invasive species, why? For the cause of the problem, when we look at invasive species, we say, all right, why is this invasive species really abundant in this lake right now? It could be because there was a disturbance before, so we've had plenty of lakes that have drawn themselves down maybe 3 or 4 feet, and then the next year come up with all this invasive species, and they wonder, well, why did this happen? And it was because they were adapted to. So when I said I worked in North Carolina, the reason why the reservoir I worked on was so abundant with hydrilla was back in the 80s. They had another plant called Brazilian elodea, which is another invasive species, not nearly as noxious as hydrilla. And it was about 500 acres in the reservoir, and the reservoir is about 20,000 acres. And the stakeholders got together and they decided with some advice from the state of North Carolina to draw the lake down. Because that particular plant, the elodea, when you draw the lake down, that it can't reproduce any other way except for vegetatively and with flowers. So if you froze the sediment out, North Carolina has a very, very slight winter, so it's mostly for drying, but they have maybe a week or two of freezing conditions. You would kill the plant and then you wouldn't have a problem. The only issue is that there was a little bit of hydrilla in that lake, and the small bit of hydrilla can produce via these tubers, which are these underwater or underground vegetative structures, but kind of like buds. So they drew the lake down, the lake froze, or it was dry. The next year they filled it up. The hydrilla acreage went from 12 acres to 490 acres in 1 year. So, and that was part of the consequence of them exposing a whole area of nutrient-rich sediment to the hydrilla, and the hydrilla came out of the drawdown and said, "That's a good spot." That's a good spot, and just completely exploded. So that's what we want to talk about. What's causing the issue? So then in the future we can say, all right, we know hydrilla. Let's say for future management on this lake, we know hydrilla has been caused by drawdown. We really need to think of, if we really want to do drawdown, we really need to think about the potential impacts of this in the future. Then identify sources of issues. So in terms of nutrient, a lot of times we do nutrient budgets for lakes, and have you ever heard of TMDLs, total daily maximum loads, which sometimes are implemented for lakes. But basically the idea is nutrients are coming from somewhere. Our job is, a big part of our job is to identify where these nutrients are coming from, what's the relative contribution of these nutrients, which actually is probably more important than, it's important to know where they are, but it's really important to know the contributions of them, and then how does that vary throughout the season, throughout the year. Are there a lot of tributaries, let's say, that are completely flashy in terms of whenever a rainstorm comes up, they come up in 5 or 6 inches of water with a relatively small rain, or is it something that's more groundwater fed? That's all important, because when you go and you develop management strategies for these lakes, you need to make sure you're trying to target which area of the lake which source of the nutrients is the highest source and where you can get the biggest reduction. So if, let's say I don't know, obviously I haven't done any work on Roaring Brook Lake, but let's just say that, just for argument's sake, 85% of the nutrients in Roaring Brook Lake came internally. That would be a really important place to focus, because then even if the technique we used got half of that, potential load, that's still half of the total load that's coming in. Versus,
what do you mean by internally?
So I have a slide on that, but basically, the lake can internally regenerate nutrients itself, and it's linked to what happens externally as well. So yeah, I will get to that. So understanding these concepts, and vice versa, if you put in a lot of money, let's say, to retrofit stormwater around the lake, however, stormwater is only 10% of your total load, and you can actually only bring it down to 5, maybe that's not the best use of funds. So understanding these contributions is really important. And then, as I was kind of led into a little bit before, to develop strategies for remediation. And this is where you guys come in, because at the end of this is where our job oftentimes stops. Our job says, identify what's the problem, how big is the problem, where is the problem coming from, and what can you do about it. And then we're, consultants and state agencies are happy to help guide you through that process, but it's up to you guys to, help either it's put pressure on the town to adopt different, practices in the watershed, or it's, you go out and maybe get some of these techniques in, either aeration, let's say, or the addition of alum, which is a chemical that can help bind phosphorus, or whatever it is. That's where it kind of starts with you guys. So kind of keeping that theme going of we take you to a certain point, but that's when the stakeholders kind of need to take over. So we're going to go through some of the sources of phosphorus. And now we're getting really close to where we're talking about lakeshore and your actual property. So internal loading, as you said, this is a really, really complicated graph. But what you need to know is the red area is where there's no oxygen at the bottom of the water. And I talked to Ina about this a bunch last week. Oxygen is one of the most important things in lakes. With nutrients and oxygen, it's probably this and this in terms of understanding what a lake does. So basically we call this graph called an isoplat. So these are the samplings from April to October of 1 year, and this is the depth. So basically you could say, you can pick a date, just any date during the summer.
July 1st.
July 1st. And then pick a depth.
6 feet.
6 feet. So July 1st, and 6 feet's about, 2 meters, so we'll say right about here. So at July 1st, at 6 feet, we had about 9 milligrams per liter of oxygen. So it's kind of a roadmap to show you where the oxygen is throughout the lake and throughout depths. The point of me showing you this is that oftentimes this is very common. During the June to August and September, there's no oxygen on the bottom of lakes. So why is that important? Well, first, a lot of animals need oxygen to survive, fish and zooplankton, even wildlife need it as well, macroinvertebrates. But more importantly, in terms of nutrients, is when no oxygen is present, certain chemical reactions happen that would normally not happen. And important for phosphorus is that normally iron and phosphorus are bound together. And when there's no oxygen, there's a reduction reaction that happens that breaks this phosphorus from iron, and then phosphorus can be put into the water. And there's other chemicals that do that we call it dissociative as well. Ammonia, manganese, hydrogen sulfide. So, important to what we're talking about, why is there no oxygen on the bottom? Well, lakes have a balance between photosynthesis and respiration, oxygen being produced by plants and oxygen being uptaken by animals. And one of the ways oxygen is being uptaken by animals is through decomposition. What goes in a lake do you think that decomposes from a lake shore?
Weeds.
Grass
Weeds.
clippings,
Goose
leaves, effluent, that's carrying different organic matter that's flowing into the lake. The algae dying and recycling, so that what we were talking about before directly leads into this. So all those inputs in the lake lead to less oxygen being, higher oxygen demand, because all the microbes are just using oxygen. When that balance flips is when you get the release of a bunch of these nutrients. And in some lakes it can be really, really severe, where we see, I think there's one lake we worked on in Long Island that had a tenfold increase between what was on the surface and what was on the bottom. So they had, you know, their surface water, I think was around 12 micrograms per liter, which is pretty good for a lake for phosphorus, but on the bottom, you know, this was only, I think 25 feet down, was 120, you know, so that's, and that nutrients can eventually come up and keep cycling. So that's one way, and to answer your question about internal loading, that lakes can kind of internally recycle these nutrients. Another way, and a more, you know, common way we think of, you know, nutrients entering the lake is through the watershed. So the next couple ones I'm going to talk about sources that are external to the lake, and one of the first ones is stormwater. And today was a great day to come out and kind of see this. Stormwater comes from, you know, really the big culprit is impervious surfaces. So any place where water cannot infiltrate into the soil, it just can pick up all the contaminants and kind of just shoot them right into the lake. Have you ever seen and it's the same concept that if you've ever seen a stream that they channelize, and they make the banks really, really thick with either riprap or rock. If you ever drive through Mayapack, as you're going on 6N right before the lake, there's that Tompkins Bank, that stream that's right before the Tompkins Bank. It's all cobblestone.